We are meant to understand what we encounter in the dream symbolically, intuitively, and metaphorically, not analytically. And I know that we're not always going to follow this rule. We all want to interpret our dreams. I am very, very into dream interpretation. But if we can follow this impulse, this deeper impulse to trust that lunar consciousness, to open at that deeper level of that intuitive understanding, we often find so much more in the dream. We connect at that level of the collective unconscious. We continue to remain mystified by the symbols that we encounter there, which I think is a lot of the point.
Greetings from the Pacific Northwest. You're listening to Symbolic Studies episode 20. I'm your host Mario, once again joined by my lovely wife Michelle. Today we'll be discussing the symbolism of dreams. If you're new to the show, we play voicemails from special guests and listeners like yourself. If you'd like to have access to early and exclusive content, please consider becoming a member on Patreon, YouTube, Substack, or elsewhere. Links can be found at symbolicstudies.com. But before we dive into these voicemails, Michelle, my lady, how are you?
I'm doing wonderful and excited for today's episode. We've been wanting to cover the topic of dreams for a while here on the podcast, so it'll be exciting to do that. Dreams to me are very important. I've always had a very active dream life ever since I was a young child. So it's something that I've noticed over the years that as I've developed as a person, my dreams have also developed and changed. And I've noticed this happening, and it's a really cool pattern to see. And I think that it's really important that we look at our dreams as a productive way to encourage ourselves to become better.
Yeah, definitely. No, this topic is absolutely huge. It's so perfect for the podcast. I'm really intrigued to hear what people have to say about things. To kick things off, we've got a voicemail from first-time guest, Marianna Louis.
What can be said about the symbol of the dream? This is such a mighty conversation, and I am very excited to be sharing some thoughts on it. My name is Marianna Louis. I'm an archetypal tarotist with a background in Jungian psychology, so that is always my lens. And whenever I'm thinking about the dream, what dreams mean, what we do with them, I always begin with the concept of the other world. Because what do dreams do? They connect us to this other world. In myth, the dream was often sent by the gods, or it was a portal into some supernatural knowledge, something that the hero couldn't possibly know. Maybe it was giving them a vision of somebody who had passed, who had some wisdom for them. However the dream presented in myth, it was always something that was beyond the hero's basic understanding. It went beyond what the ego knew. And so if we translate this into our contemporary understanding, what I would call our psychospiritual understanding, we can think of dreams as visions from the unconscious. And the unconscious, of course, is another enormous topic that cannot be reduced into a couple minutes. But basically, when we're thinking about what the unconscious is, we know that it is this vast ocean of material that is not known to us. It is not known to our waking ego mind. And Jung really broke down the unconscious in two ways. And this kind of what differentiates him from Freud a little bit, because Freud focused more on the personal unconscious, that part of the unconscious that is related directly to our personal experience. And Jung agrees that this is very much what the unconscious consists of. So that might be our repressed thoughts, our traumas that we store deep, deep down, our shadow, our beliefs that we don't want to acknowledge, all that material that is not known to us in our daily lives that still plays a really, really enormous role in how we live, whether we are aware of it or not, that exists in the personal unconscious. But Jung takes it a step further and talks about the collective unconscious. And this is where things get really interesting when we're thinking about the dream. Because the collective unconscious, according to Jung, is this deeper level of unconscious experience that is universal to all of humankind. In fact, he calls it our spiritual heritage. And in this level of unconsciousness, which is collective, we access the archetypes. And the archetypes, again, another huge concept that Jung put forth. But essentially what they are these, he calls them the psychic organs of humanity. They are these pockets, these little constellations of energetic material that are universal and appear again and again and again in our psyches, in myth, throughout all the world. Everybody has access to these archetypes. And so some examples are the Great Mother, or we might think of the trickster. And archetypes can even be those experiences like apocalypse or, the panic of death. These experiences, because they're collective, are archetypal. And so when we are in the dream world, we are both accessing material from the personal unconscious and material from that collective unconscious. This is when we have those dreams of snakes and monsters, or, enormous rainbows bursting into the sky. We know that there's something deeper about these symbols that goes beyond just whatever they mean to us in the moment. And Jung kind of differentiated these types of dreams, calling them small dreams or big dreams, basically. It's not a very fancy differentiation. But essentially, a small dream are those everyday dreams we have where maybe we've lost an earring and we're spending hours looking for it. Or we're trying to get in the car, but the car won't start. Whereas the big dreams really tap us into that collective or archetypal experience where we're encountering some kind of mystical being on our path through the forest. Or we're finding ourselves all of a sudden in the midst of a great fire. In these big dreams, we encounter those archetypal images and those symbols that carry some experience of universal wisdom. And as an archetypal tarotist, I'm always interested in these sorts of dreams and these sorts of symbols that come up in those dreams because they appear in the cards too, in many different forms. And that's really an important thing to consider whenever we're talking about symbols, whenever we're talking about archetypes, is that they're not always going to look identical. They're going to adapt in shape and form to match different cultures or to have some kind of adaptation to our personal experience. But in the cards, we see these archetypes, we see these symbols appear, and it brings them out of the night world, right? Out of that depth of the collective that is murky and hard to make sense of, and into the day world, helping us contemplate and comprehend and give us some kind of language around understanding what these symbols and what these archetypes mean for us. So a card I really like to discuss with dreams is the Moon card. And if you've never seen this card, I'm going to describe the Rider-Waite-Smith version of the card, which is the most popular version of the tarot that we use today. And in this card, we see a night landscape, and we're in some sort of wilderness. There is an ocean or some kind of body of water at the forefront of the card and a crustacean emerging from it. And then there is a wolf and a dog howling at the moon, which is enormous at the center of the card. And there is a winding path that cuts through this wilderness and passes through these two great pillars. And so when we look at this moon card, we are placed in the wilds of the unconscious otherworld. We are there in this space where there are no human structures really to orient us. And even those great pillars which are in the background are far off and kind of lost in the darkness. So what guides us through this space is what Jungians call lunar consciousness, or the intuitive and instinctual side of consciousness, which is clearly represented in this card by the animal figures. There are no humans in the card. So the moon can feel really disorienting when we're in that moon card experience. We often feel kind of lost, confused, inundated by something coming up from our depths that we don't know how to make sense of. But the task here is to heed our intuitive instincts, to continue forward on this path, this winding path through the wild, and to learn from the symbols that we encounter there at a more profound depth. And this is also how we might approach the dream, our dreams. We can try to analyze and mine them for meaning, but ultimately the symbols and the archetypes that we encounter within them speak at this level of lunar consciousness. Something that archetypal psychologist James Hillman says, he has a fantastic book called The Dream and the Underworld, and he says that the dream is meant to stay in the night world. It is not meant to be dissected and analyzed by the day world mind, what Jungians might also call solar consciousness. We are meant to understand what we encounter in the dream symbolically, intuitively, and metaphorically, not analytically. And I know that we're not always going to follow this rule. We all want to interpret our dreams. I am very, very into dream interpretation and always chatting with my friends, asking them exactly what they think my dreams mean. But if we can follow this impulse, this deeper impulse to trust that lunar consciousness, to open at that deeper level of that intuitive understanding, we often find so much more in the dream. We connect at that level of the collective unconscious. We continue to remain mystified by the symbols that we encounter there, which I think is a lot of the point. So this is how I like to approach the dream, trying to preserve its mystery, trying to preserve its depth and see it as that little gift from something beyond us that brings us into that other world space. So thank you so much, Mario and Michelle. It has been a pleasure to chat about dreams and allow me to gush about this topic, which I love talking about so much, obviously. Again, my name is Marianna Louis. I am the author of Tarot and the Psychology of the Soul, exploring the archetypal mirrors of the psyche, as well as the co-host of the Soror Mystica podcast, which dissects the great symbols and archetypes of life. And you can also find me on Instagram, Substack, YouTube at Persephone's Sister, or you can check out my website, persephonessister.com, where I offer lots of different classes on tarot and Jungian psychology and archetypes and all sorts of things. So thank you so much again.
All right, Mariana, thank you so much for that voicemail. Excellent stuff. I love what you ended with regarding the lunar consciousness and how you related that to the moon card. I think it's so interesting that, when I think of dreams, I tend to think of this watery dynamic. I think of water that's murky. I think of the depths, as she was mentioning. I think of this constant change that we often associate with water, and appropriately the moon. The moon is clearly always waxing and waning and things like that. I also think of the fact that when we're dreaming, I relate it to something along the lines of like a voyage or a journey or an adventure. So in that way, I very much relate it to ark or boat symbolism. I relate it to the chariot. I relate it to vehicles and just movement in general, which to me, there's a watery quality that's always been associated with that, in my opinion. What's intriguing to me, however, is that in some cultures, they didn't necessarily see it as watery, the dream as being watery, the way I tend to see it. They actually saw it as very fiery. There's this long tradition of perhaps seeing fire and interpreting images coming from the fire, or interpreting images coming from the shadows that the light that's cast off creates from the fire. And when you think of fire as well, there's this illusory quality. I think of that with water as well. But whenever we're talking about sort of these relationships, like when I'm saying that some culture saw it as fire, it's not necessarily physical, corporeal fire. We're talking about more of a mythical fire. But either way, I see whether you want to relate the dream world to fire in some ways or water, I think that they're both appropriate. And I think the moon and the moon card also make sense because the moon has long been mentioned as sort of a gateway to other domains, as those two pillars indicate, and as we've been talking about with Cancer season. And so, in a way, it's almost as though the moon symbolically is almost a gateway to what Mariana here is referring to as the other world, right? That's kind of an appropriate metaphor, in my opinion. And related to that, I like what she said regarding this concept of staying in the night world with these symbols and your interpretations of it and not necessarily bringing it into the day world. That's so interesting because I think that that is actually one of the things that people kind of get caught up with is they want to make the mysteries tangible. They want to make the mysteries visible, and they're the mysteries for a reason.
Right.
Because these are expressions that are beyond expression even. And so a lot of times these things you can't get a clear beat on because that's how mysterious and etheric they actually are. And so to try and bring them into the day world, something's going to be amiss. Something essentially is going to be lost in translation. So as just a piece of advice, to me, that makes a lot of sense as well. She said something along the lines of preserving the mystery that way. And that's kind of where I'm at these days with a lot of things, even though I like to be analytical and cerebral and like to talk about things sort of from a daytime perspective. There's also a huge part of me that embraces the mystery and embraces this idea that I'll never fully know what some of these things are really actually about.
Right. And isn't that something throughout life that I think is what we're supposed to end up learning? And we come to realize things like we're not supposed to necessarily know what it's like to die, for example, while we're living, but it's something that people seek out and will go to all lengths to try and study and take trips of various kinds or what have you to get to that point to understand what happens when you die. But I think that it's such a big concept and it's so otherworldly, if you want to put it that way, that we're not meant to know. And so that mystery is what keeps people chasing that carrot, but how much more peace comes when you just, as you said, embrace the mystery and let it be.
Yeah, and accept it. Mm-hmm. Right, absolutely. So to me, that was well taken.
Yes, thank you, Mariana. And to Mario's point and your point about this nighttime lunar consciousness, I have a quote here from the Mammoth Dictionary of Symbols. And it was cool. In this book, they actually go through the ways that different cultures view dreams. From Brahmaism, the state of dreaming is, quote, an unstable state where the soul is moving around, exploring domains inaccessible when one is awake. So I think this goes to the point of reminding you that it's inaccessible when you're awake for a reason, because it's not necessarily meant to be in the waking life. It's not going to maybe mean the same thing as if you were awake, but when you were asleep, there's a different meaning. And I do think, though, that there's connections that can be made, no doubt, and there's going to be symbols that might cross over, but it's going to be a different perspective entirely.
Yeah, interesting. It kind of just reminds me of the fact that we are in our waking life and we spend most of our time being productive during the day. Mm-hmm. And we have this innate desire, once again, to make things that are hidden come to the surface and to conjure up things that maybe are otherworldly, mysterious, and whatnot. We're always looking for proof. That's
right.
Sort of a thing, is that the modern mind really wants proof for everything. And so we want proof of Bigfoot or other cryptids or UFOs or angels or demons and all these different types of things. We want evidence, basically, right? And so when we don't have evidence and we don't necessarily know what's going on with something, we really try and seek knowledge of that thing to try and flesh it out and to try and really truly understand it. This goes back to something that I've mentioned before, but mankind's greatest fear, it's been said, is fear of the unknown. And so our dreams present sort of a lot of unknowable things. And so this is why I think we have this yearning or desire to make it known, to make it visible, bring it into the day side, analyze it, dissect it, and have a concrete answer, which even dream analysts and things like that, you know, this is a whole entire study, of course, and it's like a lifetime sort of study. But even then, only the person who really had the dream is going to truly perhaps know what it's about. And then even then, when you think you have clear answers, it could potentially not necessarily be exactly that there's still sort of more mystery there. This is why the greatest myths and folk tales and stories, you can decode it endlessly. There's an endless way of interpreting really, really basic storylines. And people have done that for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years with certain specific myths. And so you'll never exhaust the meaning behind some of these symbols. And so it's sort of this perpetual thing. So you could have a dream. The next day you have one interpretation. A week later, you might have another interpretation. A year later, you might have a different interpretation. So it's constantly evolving, that way. So in a way, it's not a fool's errand to try and understand your dream, but there is this sort of quality to it that makes it very elusive. Hey everyone, if you've been enjoying the podcast and want to explore further, there's an entire archive of exclusive material available through membership at symbolicstudies.com. Over the past few years, I've built a growing library of symbolic lectures, bonus podcasts, and members-only content, including 19 full-length Symbolic Secrets episodes covering the major arcana from the Fool through the Moon card, with the remaining lectures still on the way. New material is continuously being added throughout the year, and members also get early access to every new podcast, including this one. If this sounds interesting to you, head on over to symbolicstudies.com and explore the archive. Membership is only $5 a month and directly supports the show. All right, back to our episode on the symbolism of dreams. I also like the fact that she brought up the difference between big and small dreams. That's how I see it, and I see that there's really everything in between. Just like life, there are things that happen every day. There are things that sort of happen in our mundane life that occurs on a weekly basis, monthly basis. We go through smaller trials and tribulations, and then every once in a while we have something really epic happen, and then every great once in a while something major and profound sort of happens in our life that is sort of like a sea change. And so we go through these major sort of swings and smaller swings. There's peaks and valleys of different sizes, and that's kind of how I see our dream world too, that there are dreams that essentially are fairly meaningless and kind of arbitrary. There are other dreams that are worth trying to understand, in my opinion. And there's dreams that are going to shake you whether you like it or not. Mm-hmm. And even if you're not trying to literally consciously understand it, you can't stop thinking about it because it was so profound or it made such an impact. And so I think we kind of have this really wide spectrum of dreams. And actually, there's a few categories here of dreams that I wanted to list off, including prophetic dreams, initiatory dreams, telepathic dreams, visionary dreams, warning dreams, dreams that have some sort of warning to them, and then also mythological dreams. And once again, I think there's some dreams that are fairly simple, straightforward, not really worth your time of day, probably trying to decode. And I think this is important because I think some people spend a lot of time trying to break down certain dreams that maybe they should just let go of.
Right, yeah.
And so to me, that was well taken as well. The idea that there are different types of different sort of value symbolically. And I think you'll know the ones that you really need to pay attention to, right?
Oh, yes. I totally agree with that. And what this brings me to is some of the things I've learned about dreams through studying herbalism. And one of the things that repeatedly comes up, depending on the herbalist that you're studying with, is the fact that if you are going through some sort of health ailment or you have something coming up and you're not quite sure what the deal is with it, it's wise to ask for insights from your dreams. So having the practice of before you're going to bed and you're wanting to get the answer to something that you may feel like you aren't able to gather the answer of, that you can actually tune in and ask for support in your dream time. I have done this. Things have come through, and sometimes they come through without even asking, which is one of the cooler things about it. And sometimes it's with hindsight that you come to realize what the message was that you were supposed to gather about your own health or the health of someone else. So, for example, in Native American culture, it was very common that the shaman of the community or the medicine person of the community would utilize their dream time to find remedies for the person that came to them or maybe themselves. And I have a couple quotes here from Matthew Wood out of his book, The Book of Herbal Wisdom, in which he talks about this. He writes, The oldest method of acquiring herbal wisdom is the shamanic journey, which takes place during dream time for education and training. Very often, medicine people are taught in the dream world by an animal or spirit person about a plant or plants. At the same time, they are also taught about plants by the animals using them in the regular/waking world, which I think is very interesting too, because we can observe an animal who may be eating some type of nut or some type of leaf at a certain time of the year for a certain reason. Bears are a very good example with this. They will eat the roots of plants in the spring that tend to help digest fats and stimulate digestion because they have just been sleeping for the winter, or they had been lower energy in the winter. So there's all these ways of being able to figure out how plants can be used effectively. But I think it's really interesting when you think about the dream world being a source of information for this.
Yeah, very interesting. So I just have to mention this idea of searching for something. What is even the symbolism of the search or the hunt? You're looking for something, you're on a quest, you're on an adventure. I always bring up these famous relics that people are looking for, like the Holy Grail, Ark of the Covenant, things like that. And what I always say is that these relics, the Philosopher's Stone is another good one, these relics are symbolic of an internal treasure, something to be found within. And I think this may be true with the dream world too. And so someone's search within a dream of what does this symbol mean? What does that symbol mean? You know, it kind of is a way to fast track the whole process and acknowledge that what you're really looking for at the end of the day is something to be found within. And this is intriguing because we're getting these symbols from within as well.
Right.
And this kind of brings up another point that I just wanted to clarify, is that we're going to hear several mentions of the unconscious in the podcast today. And from my understanding, synonymously, some people will use subconscious as well. And actually, I have to give credit, once again, to Renee Ganon for turning me on to the concept that what we're really dealing with is the supraconscious. And that when we're dealing with the subconscious, that obviously implies something lower. And I think these dreams are coming from a divine realm. And so symbolically, they're coming from a higher place. And so this is also the idea that it's not what's lurking underneath that's affecting us. It's something that's coming from a higher order that's affecting us. And so this is kind of the flip or reversal of the main difference between Ganonian traditionalism and maybe modern psychology, and sort of where this influence comes from. Does the influence come from, quote unquote, the above realms, the heavens, source, or does it come from the depths? And in psychology, you're going to see an emphasis on things coming from the depths. And so in my opinion, I think it's actually a bit of a reversal. So I just wanted to clarify that. But obviously, people are completely welcome to discuss things how they see it. And so I'm just giving my 2 cents here about how I perceive things. So does that make sense?
Yes, 100% makes sense. When you first brought this to the table after you learned it, it really resonated with me. And one of the reasons why is because I feel like dreams ride within the same space as inspiration or a creative expression, something like that. And to me, those sorts of things usually do come from a higher source, is what it seems like. And I feel like when you think of something as below, it's almost as if it doesn't matter as much, or it doesn't have as an important place in your life, which I don't think is true. If you look at it like a superconscious, that to me makes a lot more sense as to why it sometimes feels like a divine intervention when you have a dream that is so significant to you that actually can help alter the course of your life.
Right. You know, I think a good metaphor for this is actually one of the most famous dream stories or sequences in history, arguably. And this is Jacob's Ladder. And Jacob's Ladder is the story of Jacob having this very profound dream in Genesis, in the Bible. And the idea, it's very short, but he falls asleep and then he sees a ladder basically ascending to the heavens, and angels are ascending and descending down this ladder. That is the perfect metaphor of what I'm trying to explain here, is that it's actually speaking to where dreams come from as well. Is they're coming from a higher domain. It's coming from a higher source. It's coming from a higher order, not a lower order. And this is another thing with the word unconscious, just to throw my 2 cents out there, is that everything is consciousness. And so everything comes from this great consciousness that we all share. And so something can't be unconscious here, especially you. And so that's kind of another thing that just wanted to clarify, my personal perspective on things, where they come from. And this to me is the proper orientation for things when it comes to where these dreams are coming from and whatnot. So Jacob's ladder isn't descending into the earth or underground. It is connected to the above realm, right? The heavens. And so to me, this makes a little bit more sense, but to each their own, obviously.
Hello, Mario. JM DeBord here from dreamschool.net. And yes, I would love to talk with you and the folks at Symbolic Studies about one of my favorite subjects, dream symbolism. I teach courses on this at Dream School, and I nerd out on this subject. So it's kind of obscure. It's really important for dream interpretation. And yeah, let's see if we can do this in about 10 minutes. So here is the Cliff Notes version of the Owl School of Dreaming lesson on dream symbolism. First of all, it is a language. It uses symbols and context to express meaning. Each symbol could be thought of as a shorthand way of expressing an idea. A dream symbol is that and more. There's feelings and emotions and perceptions and ways you process the world, your self-concepts. It's all present there in the symbol. And the meaning is very personal to you. The way that the dream connects and creates that meaning is intimately tied with you and your way of seeing things and your experience of life, the culture that you grew up in. And there's also something deeper about symbols, which I think often gets overlooked in discussions, is that they are like graphical user interfaces for deeper parts of the psyche. When you interact with the symbol, you're actually interacting with the structures or the programming of your own psyche. Like when you interact with a dream character, which is really just a type of symbol, like a walking, talking symbol, the dream character is actually an interface for maybe something about your personality or your character or your psychological makeup. So when you are in this environment that we call a dream, it's presenting everything to you in symbolic form. Carl Jung said this, that behind the literal imagery of a dream, you have to surmise that there is this deeper, this non-literal, this figurative meaning to it. So dreams communicate with this, the symbolism as a language. And it's also a language that's very efficient. It communicates ideas very easily. You could say, a whole chapter's worth of information could be summarized in one image in some cases. And then when you string symbols together, like symbolism does, now you can get into really complex ideas, but expressed very efficiently and quickly, which we know in dreams. That's why they have such a deep impact sometimes on you and can really dig deep into who you are and what your experience of life has been like and your history, biography. All of that stuff comes together in the symbols of your dreams. So symbolism is this language of communicating through symbols. And it's important for dream interpretation. You have to assume that everything that you're interacting with is some kind of symbolic representation. So, what could that be? What could that representation be of? And this is where dream interpretation goes down a path of decoding symbolism, at least in my Dreams 1, 2, 3 method. I teach in the step 2 of 1, 2, 3 is one half of it is you decode the symbolism and the other half of it is you analyze the story so that you can understand how the dream is presenting the meaning of particular symbols. It all has to be understood in the context of the overall narrative. It has to be understood to really understand the dream. When you look at dream symbolism and you understand it as a language, you can now start to see how the mind that's using that language works, which would be the unconscious mind. I think that symbolism is the native language of the unconscious mind. And of course, the unconscious is the co-creator of your dreams, along with the ego. The ego is interacting with the content that is being brought up by the unconscious for that night of dreaming, or that segment, that sleep phase or stage. It's presenting this content, and you're having these dreams, which are chronicling that interaction. So the symbolism is the native language of the unconscious mind, and the dreams are the chronicle of the interactions that happen while you're dreaming. So now let's get into some of the nuts and bolts of decoding the language of symbolism. I love teaching this, and it can go really deep, but for our purpose, let's just use something that we can use as a vehicle for telling the story, for giving this little lesson on decoding dream symbolism. Let's say that the dream starts with a car. It's a vehicle. You know what I meant it as, more of a metaphor. But the car is now presented in the dream, but there's going to be things about that car that are going to stand out to you. They are like the car could be thought of as the noun, and the way that the car drives can be thought of as the verb. Is it going too fast, too slow? Is it going in circles? All of these things can be understood as metaphors, basically. Now, if you see a car, you're putting your foot down on the gas and the car isn't getting anywhere, it can mean that you're pushing or driving yourself, but not getting any progress made. You go to fill up an empty tank at the gas station, and that could mean that you're filling up with energy of some kind. Maybe energy means motivation, the gas that fuels you, that drives you. These plays on language are everywhere in dreams. The ways that they take words that we understand commonly in one context or definition and then play around with them. So now driving a car means like your drive or your ambition. And then the color of the car could mean something, especially like an emotional tone to it. The colors that are used in dreams tend to have meaning related to emotional tone and feeling tone. Dream symbolism, it really matches and follows along with our language in so many different ways. You can find word plays, metaphors everywhere. Our metaphors are all over the place in dreams. In fact, there was a early psychiatrist, actually, Montague Ullman, who was important in the study of dreams and establishing metaphors as a primary way that dreams express meaning. The metaphors are used in this context. I mean, this is really the basis of symbolism. It's in the way that it creates meaning. It's in the same way that metaphors create meaning. And there's an interesting psychological fact about metaphors and the way that they impact the mind, especially when they express something about you personally, when they're revealing something about you. Now, remember that a metaphor makes a comparison between two things that appear to be unlike. There doesn't seem to be this relationship until that hidden relationship is revealed, and there's that aha moment. Well, in the same sort of way, the unconscious mind uses metaphors to express meaning because they get around the ego's barriers and filters. Metaphors have this way of having an impact and getting around those things so that, those defenses. And so dreams use this language of symbolism that is packed full of metaphors so that it can put you into these interactive scenarios which we call dreams or dreaming, which appear to be mostly, at least the most meaningful and impactful dreams, about learning and growth, discovery, finding out how you really tick inside. It used to be that dream symbolism was taught as a primary way of interpreting dreams, especially back during the heyday of analytical psychology. But the part that people often miss is what Jung said after he advised anyone who wants to really learn how to interpret dreams to decode symbolism. He said, you have to learn that you have to learn how to speak that language, or at least to translate the language. So dream interpretation can really start to be understood now as interpretation of a language instead of couched in what to that point had been almost exclusively psychoanalytic language about symbols and symbolism, which came from the Freud's school. But Jung said that, yes, learn all of that, master this language, really learn how to translate it, how to speak it. And then when you work with a dream, forget about all that stuff, especially when you're working with someone on a dream, which I do as a dream worker. I can come into the process with all this knowledge of symbolism, but when I'm working with someone on a dream, I'm really relating to an experience that that person had, an experience that I know that they gave themselves. The dream is a self-created experience. And when you start from that basic fact, there's a lot that you can extrapolate and learn and follow to get through a dream from beginning to end and start to understand what it is that it means, that it offers, that it has for you. So, which I find, just incredibly exciting. And every time it happens in a way that really brings enlightenment, or, in the sense of like, the person understands themselves better through their dream. And there's some way that I've been able to help them to do that because I help them to understand the symbolism. And once they understand the symbolism, they can start making the connections between the dream content in their lives. And you see that light bulb go on, and it's so exciting to be part of that. Mario, thank you for giving me this chance to share what I know with you and your audience. And by the way, I have a podcast. It hasn't been active in a while, but we had over 40 episodes we put out. Were deep dives into dream work. It's called The Dreams That Shape Us. Thanks again, Mario. And this is JM. I'm out.
All right, JM DeBord, thank you so much for that contribution there. Excellent stuff. There's a few things I definitely want to chew on here, including the fact that you mentioned that symbols are efficient. That is so true. I've said this before, but it's said that if a picture is worth 1,000 words, that a symbol is worth 1,000 pictures. And so for any symbol that you're referring to, there are endless ways of decoding it. However, every symbol participates in a universal quality. They all point at something beyond itself. They're pointing to a higher order. They're pointing to a higher domain. This is why, in my opinion, it's really appropriate to refer to symbols as bridges or supports to a higher concept. And this higher concept is more universal. There's a unifying quality to it. And so while we have thousands or millions or endless symbols, like a mandala, they all orient themselves around one point of pivot. That there is a center or a sacred center that they all revolve around. And so it's not unlike a world tree, right? There's how many branches, how many leaves, how many berries on a tree, but they're all unified with their central trunk. Symbolism is very much the same way. No matter what you're talking about, it participates in this universal framework, in my opinion. And so to me, this is really the heart of symbolism, is realizing that all symbols actually are referring to source. They're all referring to the supreme principle. They're all referring to, I oftentimes bring up the world axis, this axis between the above and below realms that everything revolves around. They all are basically subordinate to that central axis, right? So I say this all the time, but everything emanates from and returns back to that same center. So all symbols are actually an echo or a fractal of that same center from which it came from and will return back to. So this dynamic is worth unpacking just a little bit further as well, because it reminds me quite a bit of, as an example, like the wheel. So you have the unified center of the wheel, the axle of the wheel, the point in the middle of the wheel, but then you have endless points on the circumference of the wheel. So the external part of the wheel would be related to multiplicity. It would be related to division. The center of the wheel relates to unity. And so even though the different points of the wheel on the circumference, even though there are many, they all have a relationship with the center of the wheel, but they're all subordinate to the center of the wheel. And so to me, this is worth talking about because when we're participating in a dream, it feels as though we're interacting with other people. It feels as though we're interacting with animals and objects and whatnot. But all of these animals, all of these people, everything you interpret or see in a dream came from within. And so there's this idea that within unity, the individual unified self, you can experience multiplicity. And the dream is actually a really good metaphor for this. So this kind of reminds me of the idea that the kingdom of God is within. That basically it's within that contains a multitude of things. It's within self that you can see this multiplicity of things, even though self in totality is unified. Even though you are unified unto yourself, there are many things within you. So there's this idea of there being many rooms within your own mansion, right? To me, this is an important distinction because when you are dreaming and you are interacting with something else, you are both the observer and the object at the same time. And so none of these things, in my opinion, are really outside of self. And so they've all been generated from within. Just as JM said, dreams are a self-created experience, 100%. So the power of metaphors, as JM was talking about as well, has everything to do with what symbolism is really about, in that all symbols basically are representations of principles. They're representations of metaphysical concepts. And so they're representations of something primary. And so we can't help but sort of understand that just intuitively, just innately. You know, you're walking through the forest and you come across a beautiful scene. You come across an amazing tree or an amazing mountain or something like that. And it can literally stop us in our tracks. And suddenly we feel something. Suddenly we might be emotional or we start reflecting or whatnot. And so we know, as an example with the tree or the mountain, that it represents this connection between above and below, that it represents this connection between heaven and earth. And so once again, it's pointing to something beyond itself. All animals, all colors, all numbers, anything symbolic, really its true value is beyond its form, is beyond what you're just visually seeing. It's actually more so having to do with what it represents on a higher level. Just like what I was saying with the subconscious, unconscious thing earlier on, that it's almost like Jacob's ladder, that every symbol is a ladder to this higher domain. And this higher domain is connected with our inner landscape, the domain within. That's the key.
Yeah, right on. You know, thank you, JM. Great contribution here. And what this brings me to is another quote I have from the Penguin Dictionary of Symbols. And he writes, as Frederick Gosson has so aptly put it, quote, dreams are symbols of the individual's experience, so deeply lodged in the depths of consciousness that they elude their own creators, and we view them as the most secret and uninhibited expression of our very selves. Now, to me, this kind of goes along with what you're saying, that it's already embedded in us. And what this brings me to is the thought of maybe perhaps dreams help or allow us to remember what we already know. And from my own experience, a lot of the answers we seek in life, regardless of what that answer is that you're looking for, a lot of times already reside within. But it's whether or not your mind or your heart is open to understanding that you already have the answers. And I think that might be the difference between us feeling helpless, like we need the help from an outside source, versus having the confidence to know that, okay, I might need to get grounded, get centered, and really take some time to actually ask myself the right questions so that I can actually tap into the correct answers that I already have within. And I think in today's society and times beyond this, we are distracted a lot. So we're not able to realize that we have the answers within. And so I think things like dreams actually can help to ground us in that way and to help us understand that we actually do have the answers.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, the way I perceive it is generally, you're totally right. The solution to whatever problem you feel like you're facing oftentimes is much, much, much closer than you realize.
Right.
And so with that in mind, just to riff off of what you're saying here, is I think dreams remind us that we are divine, that we are spiritual.
Right.
Don't get so caught up in the mundane day-to-day sort of thing, the rat race or the hamster wheel. And so this is one of the things that the modern mind tends to forget, is that we are sacred and we are divine and we are connected to source in a way that will make you weep if you truly understood it, right? And so I think that that is sort of one of my takeaways from studying dreams the last couple of weeks to prepare for the show, is that it's a reminder of our divine connection. It's a reminder of our divine spark. It's a reminder of our spirituality. And so we forget that. And so in today's modern world, people are so busy, people are so anxious, people have all these different things that they have to concern themselves with, responsibilities, all sorts of things, that we lose sight of the fact of what we innately are on a spiritual level. And so I think dreams kind of wake us up to that. And then suddenly in the dream realm, you're like, whoa, it was so interesting and cool, and it was mystical, and it was profound, and it was deep, and it was layered. Yeah, that is actually you in your waking life as well. But you are just so focused on whatever your daily goals are, whatever your waking life goals are, that you're losing sight of the fact that you are this spiritual being having a physical experience. The modern mind tends to think that we're just physical beings having a spiritual experience, but it's the exact opposite, that we are innately spiritual, that is the foundation, that is who we really actually are. And ancient peoples understood this. So ancient peoples had a sacred relationship with everything in their life because they understood that everything had meaning, everything had value, everything was this quote unquote support or bridge to the spirit realm or to source. And so I think that that is one of the big roles that dreams are sort of here for, now that I really think about it, is to just remind you of all this stuff.
Dang, that's beautifully said.
Thank you. So something that this reminds me of is the word inspiration, to be inspired. We find dreams to be inspirational. And even when someone is inspired to do something, it's not uncommon for them to say that I have a dream.
Ah, right.
And so that my dream is to become this. My dream is to do that. And so notice that inspiration has I in right in the beginning. Inspiration. So just to continue riffing on that theme here, that's one of the things that I kind of see is it keeps us inspired. And sometimes I think a nightmare sort of inspires us, but to actually just change things a little bit. And that you realize, oh my goodness, I really need to get my shit together. I really need to figure this out. I really need to change my ways, or something along these lines, right? That the nightmare will fuel you to actually change and do better.
Yes, I'm so glad you brought up inspiration. And this kind of already came up once, but when we think about dreams as a place of inspiration for change or understanding or what have you, I think it's more productive in the long term. When we first started studying, I thought of Barbara Walker almost immediately because in her tarot deck, the Seven of Cups is entitled Dreams. And so I knew that I wanted to check in with her and see what her interpretation is of this subject. And from her book, Secrets of the Tarot, she basically talks a lot about how dreams and inspiration are innately linked and that there's a lot of crossover there. And so she's referring to the Six of Cups and then the Seven of Cups in this quote here. The symbolic return to the children's land, signified by the Six of Cups, led naturally to the Seven's implication of pre-verbal modes of thought. The rich depths of the unconscious tapped by dreams and archetypal imagery. Here dwelt inspiration, literally, quote, breathing in a spirit and idea, literally the goddess within. So again, we're going back to this inspiration from within, though. Like all of these things are coming through, but it's coming from the goddess within, the goddess that's within all of us, because we all harness the feminine and the masculine at once. So with all this said, it makes me think of what she also brings up is just the concept of the muses and how the muses are a deep source of inspiration, and that we can all have a muse or even be our own muses for projects, for thoughts, for ideas, for things that we want to bring into the physical or create or what have you. And I think that it all comes from this divine source of inspiration that we all have within, as we're talking about, but there's also this symbolic cauldron, I think, that comes through, where in this symbolic cauldron, it's a vessel, it's a chalice, it's whatever you want to look at as a something that holds something. But in here is where we find that deep inspiration for things. And, you know, it's just something to really think about when we're looking at all the dream stuff and where it comes from. And so to go a little bit deeper with the cauldron, actually from Barbara's book here, she equates the cauldron to a vessel that generates life and inspiration. And it can be synonymous to a cup or the grail, a fountain, a well, the sacred heart, or even source. So it can be looked at all these things, or it may be represented by all of those things I just listed, but ultimately it is this main cauldron sort of source that we're tapping into.
Right, this cauldron within. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, definitely. I think it's interesting that even the Temperance card, you know, it's well known for having an angel with two cups and she's pouring from one to the other. But the Thoth deck, it's known as art, and then there's a cauldron right in front of her.
Right.
You know, so it's this idea that you are tapping in, basically. So I think that the Holy Grail is one of the best examples of that, is that you're seeking, once again, the Holy Grail within, essentially, your sacred center, which is basically an inexhaustible well of inspiration and insights, knowledge, etc.
Hi. I'm Layne Dalfen, the Dream Analyst. Since there are so many ways of looking at symbols, I want to preface how it is that I've come to understand and use symbols in the analysis of dreams. In the 50 years I have been working with my own and others' dreams, here's the premise on which I like to begin. A few points so that you understand where I'm coming from. In my experience, every dream at the first level is triggered by a very specific, very recent waking situation or person you either thought about or that happened to you the day before the dream. You are trying to come to a conclusion, a decision, a solution, or an approach about that experience. The dream is an interior, problem-solving discussion that takes place between the conscious and the unconscious mind. In order to have that conversation, we need language, of which symbols are a big part. Since the discussion is a problem-solving one, and since I am not in the business of mind reading, I always have two goals. The first is to learn and help the dreamer discover what issue they were discussing with themselves inside the dream. Since the solution to what we are grappling with this week appears in the dream before we get it consciously, my second goal is to uncover the solution. To understand this interior conversation, we need to understand the language. For that purpose, I developed a 6-point of entry system, of which symbols are a big part. That's where I am focusing this discussion. When it comes to symbols, I will say that from the time we are born, Every single memory and association we have ever had is stored in our vast and very sophisticated unconscious mind. It is a stunning database. Since I'm 74, I prefer to think of this database as a filing cabinet. You're thinking about a current circumstance. When you fall asleep, that vast filing cabinet opens up and you pick and choose specific memories and associations that, when put together, are your unique vocabulary. The situation is unique. The people involved are unique to your life, and so is the language you use. You can't look it up in one of those, you can't look up your personal life in one of those dream dictionaries. One last point. In the business of dream analysis, symbols appear as people, places, or things. You know the expression, one picture is worth 1,000 words? Here's a dream to illustrate how understanding even one symbol can reveal not only the current waking problem, but the solution. A woman shared her dream with me saying, I saw a white skunk in my home. I didn't know albino skunks even exist. I tried to spray it with water and it ran away. It seemed helpless and small. In response to my asking what comes to mind about skunks, she replied, they stink and it's hard to get the smell off. Looking at the plot to help find the dreamer's reflection, I asked if she's feeling like someone or something is inside her space, and I added, besides that, if whatever it is perhaps stinks. I wondered aloud if maybe there's an element of surprise about them being there too. Because she said the skunk seemed helpless and small, I also wondered if her waking situation involves someone she feels is helpless, and if that's why she let the skunk in. The dreamer caught her dream immediately. She said, the situation that stinks is because we very recently sold and bought a new home. My husband asked my dad to give us a loan until the closing date, and my father pretended not to understand what was being asked of him. Now my husband is completely turned off, which also stinks. Yesterday, my dad came by to visit, and my husband left the house before he even arrived. My father doesn't like it that my husband rarely calls him just to say hi, but when he needed money, he didn't hesitate to lift the phone. I don't like it that my father refused to extend us the loan and was especially upset to learn he told my mom that he would have given it to us had she not stepped in to help. As for my husband, I am truly uncomfortable with his leaving the house when my dad is visiting. Both men, in my opinion, have ego issues. Using a skunk in her dream is a terrific example of how dreams can use one personal metaphor, like a skunk, to point you to the problem. If you look to the real life aspect of a dream symbol, you can often find solutions to the problem right there in front of you. Using that method for problem solving, I asked, if you really did have a skunk inside your house, how would you remove the smell? What would you do? She said, you would need to air the place out. It takes a little time, but the air will clear. This dreamer got so curious about skunks, she looked up more information and read it to me. Let the sunlight in, as this will help oxidize the odor. Finally, it said to place bowls of vinegar in each room of the house and leave them in place for a day or two until the scent is gone. I love how it said to make sure the bowls are out of reach of pets and children. It fits her situation so well. She asked me, how is that going to work going forward? And I encouraged this dreamer to heed the advice she found about removing the skunk smell. Air the place out. In other words, Speak to your husband and to your father about how all this makes you feel. Bring sunlight in by way of discussion. As we know, the sourness of vinegar can describe what working through a conflict tastes like. It's good advice to clear the air with your husband and your father while the children are away. Maybe after speaking to you, your husband and father will be able to clean the air through their own conversation. Here's another short and very personal dream I had some 30 years ago, in which my late aunt, who I had not seen in years, appeared. Treating her as a symbol, I asked myself, what are the first things that come to mind when I think of her? What style of person was she? Immediately, I thought about her mouth. If she loved you, she would tell you. And if she was angry, she had no problem telling you about that either. Trying to attach my dream to the waking situation it was reflecting, using just that one symbol, it came to me almost immediately. My husband, who is one of the nicest people you can meet, also has a temper. And the night before the dream, he yelled at me. And what did I do? I stood there silent. Why? This is no surprise, because in the home I grew up in, speaking up was considered disrespectful. So as a child, I like to say I became over-exercised in staying quiet and under-exercised in expressing my feelings. It's not that any characteristics are not inside us and accessible. All of our potential is available. For me, it's more about getting accustomed to being able to access all of our potential, depending on the specific situation at hand. The one symbol of my aunt simultaneously provided me two things. First, her appearance linked me to the situation I was discussing with myself in the dream. I asked myself, who in my life recently behaved like her? The answer was immediately. My husband had yelled at me, and I stood there silent, same as I would have if I was 7 years old. But my aunt's appearance in the dream also provided me with a solution. My unconscious mind was inviting me to lean in to that unfamiliar, under-exercised aspect of my potential. I am never here to say that change is easy, and I am always here to say that change is possible. And while we are powerless over changing anybody else, we are all powerful about changing ourselves. Since my aunt's appearance in my dream, I have had many occasions to exercise and become familiar with what Jung would have called my shadowy side. In these 30 years since, I have built a strong muscle and now unafraid to speak, and along with it, the people close to me have changed too, now aware that I am not afraid to speak. If you are interested in finding out more about me and my work, please visit me at either thedreamanalyst.com or at the same URL as the title of my books, haveagreatdream.com. I also want to invite you to my upcoming Dreaminar at Eventbrite on Sunday, August 23rd, 2026, from 2 to 4 Eastern Time. The links are all here for you. I will finish by saying we humans have an extraordinary ability to multitask, the evidence of which is so often seen in our dreams. Synchronicity, ESP, and the spiritual abound. Staying inside my niche, what I have presented here is a view of symbols in dreams from a psychological problem-solving perspective. I want to point out, too, how other points of view are simultaneously being presented inside the same dream. For example, while the appearance of my late aunt in my dream highlights my potential response to a given situation, How do we know she wasn't also paying me a visit at the same time? She probably was.
All right, Layne, thank you so much for that voicemail. Excellent stuff. Really interesting story regarding the skunk, right? And this idea of a situation stinking and how the skunk represents that. And then I love how you went further with this regarding how to rid the house of the skunky smell and how that relates to some of the other aspects within that dynamic for this person that you were doing analysis for. This reminds me so much of traditional medicine and how traditional medicine works and how you can have a stink conflict and how this can actually lead to issues with your nose, as an example. The same way if you saw something that was really traumatic, that could lead to eye issues. The same way if you're having a hard time digesting something, digesting information, this can lead to digestive issues. So I'm sure you picked that up as well, right, Bob?
I did. It's one of the things that I actually wrote down when we first listened to her voicemail, because it does make me think of how the stink conflict, it can bring on a common cold. It can bring on congestion out of nowhere or what have you. And you're trying to figure out what is going on when it's actually what you're being asked to look at is the situations that are happening around you. What perhaps you are trying to resolve at the moment that maybe literally, quote, stunk, or the situation itself stinks. So then your body is reacting to this by giving you these symptoms so that you can tap into these feelings and emotions that your body is responding to. The other thing I have written down here is a territorial conflict. When we think of scent and we think of the way that an animal will mark a territory, they are putting their scent out for another animal to smell so that they will either be attracted to the area or they're putting up a territorial boundary so that it is known that this area belongs to whatever animal just sprayed here. This could cause a stink conflict because of what the spraying is putting out because of that scent. But this could also cause a territorial conflict because what we're working with is the urine. It's the bodily fluid that is putting out the scent. So in the case of a skunk, it's not the skunk's urine, obviously, that's putting out that smell, but it is one of its bodily fluids that's being projected onto something that is going to cause a smell or cause some sort of territorial fear conflict that the skunk is having.
So just to be clear here, this is so interesting. So we think and feel and interpret everything symbolically. That is just the nature of this reality here. We can't escape it. This is why symbolism, the study of symbols, to me is so valuable and so important because it really is helpful for so many different types of situations. And what we're trying to highlight today is another one of these examples. So if you're going through a situation in life that quote unquote stinks, now look how we're talking about skunk symbolism and what skunks are known for and everything else. This is not unlike these conflicts that we're referring to, where if something stinks in your family dynamic, then this could lead to nasal issues. This can lead to physical ailments, essentially. The dream world is giving you the exact same dynamic, but it's not expressing itself physically. If this issue went unchecked, it could lead to a physical ailment, as we're saying. And so I just think it's really interesting that no matter how you slice it, your body is informing you symbolically of a situation in a way that you wouldn't have expected. This is something that people need to really be looking out for because so many people are dealing with physical ailments because symbolically their body is interpreting a situation in a way that is going to express itself physically. So no matter what, whether it's happening mentally in your dream world or it's happening physically, your body is trying to inform you about something you're dealing with symbolically. The classic example I bring up is Ray Charles. Ray Charles saw his brother die, and that is what caused his blindness. It wasn't a physical issue. It was a quote-unquote psychological issue. It was an emotional issue. It was a spiritual issue. His story, basically, with what he went through, symbolically the sense that was the source of trauma now is being shut down to no longer, more than likely, experience even more trauma. That's kind of how I interpret it.
Right. And a way to look at that is actually it was Ray's body's attempt to protect him.
Exactly.
Because the body realized that he saw something so shocking enough to take away one of the most important senses that we have. So his body learned that it was through the eyes that caused him so much distress. So the body's response was, okay, we're going to cloud this so that can never happen again.
Yes, exactly. And so I know there's plenty of people dealing with digestive issues because there's a lot of things in today's world or in their personal life that they literally cannot digest. So it's just very fascinating to me that your body is always trying to inform you. And symbolism needs to be understood in that way, not just physical, sort of mechanical, Western allopathic medicine that treats you like a machine. You know, we have to take the emotional into consideration and we have to take symbolism into consideration as well. And both the traditional medicine perspective and this dream analysis perspective that Layne's talking about is informed symbolically. And so it just lets you know that this is sort of the modality that we're always operating on, whether we like it or not.
Yeah. And isn't it brilliant that the dream comes in and intersects to give you that opportunity before it becomes more of a physical problem or a physical ailment, to deal with it through the dream realm so that you can understand it more, so that you can process it in a more healthy way, as opposed to it becoming a manifested symptom or issue that then is going to perhaps be even harder to deal with than it would have if you were just to be able to see these things clearly and interpret them through the dream.
There you go. That's what I was trying to say. You summarized it very well. I'm right there with you. Brilliant, brilliant stuff. So to piggyback off of this, Layne's dream situation regarding her aunt being symbolic of actually expressing yourself and what's on your mind, and she used the word mouth, totally makes sense in this regard too. And so your body doesn't make mistakes. And so that's one thing that I think modern people sort of have twisted a little bit, is this idea that our body is always making mistakes and that our own quote unquote psychology is making mistakes. Everything is in an effort to seek equilibrium, in my opinion. Everything is in an effort to get to a harmonious place. So when you're sick, we know now, with our perspective, this is actually a good sign. Your body's trying to heal itself. Your body's trying to tell you something. It's not just this negative deficit sort of thing. It's your body's trying to communicate to you, hey, something's going on and we're doing the best we can to repair it. In fact, when you try to intervene in certain ways, that can make everything way worse. Sometimes you need to let your body just be and allow it to heal. And sometimes the more you get in the way of that, by not resting, not eating the proper foods, you know, all these different types of things, you're just going to exacerbate the issue. And so to me, I think that's just worth saying. Hey guys, it's Mario once again. Just wanted to let you know that Michelle and I are now recording companion episodes for all of our podcasts. So if you're looking for even more insights on dreams and dream symbolism, keep an eye out for our After Hours release. We'll be continuing the conversation and covering everything else we weren't able to get to in the main episode. After Hours is for members only, and of course, we hope you consider joining. Become a member and access all of the exclusives at symbolicstudies.com. Okay, back to the show.
Wonderful points, Bub. And Layne, thank you, because you're bringing up a lot of great things that are sparking some wonderful conversation. And I also enjoyed what she tacked on at the end there, talking about the fact that there is some sort of spiritual connection to this, that perhaps it was also her aunt coming to, quote, visit her, you know, to remind her of these things that actually are all within Layne already, because it was within her aunt, and her aunt is part of her family, which we have connection to that lineage so deeply that sometimes we can even forget how connected we are to our family on these underlying or above lying levels, where we can tap into the dreams, or vice versa, they're going to tap into our dream realm to remind us of these important things that we might need to understand in our waking life. And it brings me to a quote that I have here Again, from the Mammoth Dictionary of Symbols. And this is from the perspective of the ancient Egyptian way of looking at dreams. The ancient Egyptians thought that nighttime sleep was the dead time of creation, a time for return to primal chaos, which put man in contact with all beings and visions haunting the world of the uncreated, which were, however, a kind of premonition of the future. So I think that this kind of speaks to that thought of us being connected to a spiritual aspect in the dream world, and that there is some sort of message that could be there for you that's going to help you in a future situation. So it's going to bring you into the present, as it should, because it's going to be reminding you of a situation that maybe just took place, but it's actually helping you to formulate what you're going to do in order to make this situation better or resolve a conflict that could be coming up in the future for you.
Right. Well, one thing I'll say about all of that is 100% I'm convinced, and people know by now if you listen to the show, I come from a traditionalist Ghanaian perspective with things. And there is no doubt that people receive premonitions, people have telepathic sort of interactions in their dream world. People have met each other in their dreams, and both parties recall the conversation and how everything happened. There's so many things that happen in our dream world. She mentioned synchronicities and whatnot. And the thing I'll just put out there is that I'm convinced that these things happen. How do they actually happen? I can't say. And this is more of the psychic sort of domain. And while that domain exists, and there are real things that happen all the time in our psychic space, if you will, I think one of the things that people need to be cautious of is overemphasizing the significance or the value or the message that's being received with that. And I think that a lot of people in today's world, what they do is they seek that kind of information.
Right.
And they try to induce that kind of information. And they think that that's the only valuable information. And so to me, it's just one of these things where I would just be somewhat cautious about following a thread of information because you got it in a dream, following a sort of line of action because a synchronicity sort of brought it to your table. These things should be acknowledged, but I think that you can get too caught up in them. The same way people get too caught up in their own chart, the same way people get too caught up in fortune telling and forecasting. In my opinion, these things they deserve to be acknowledged, but I think that you can take them too far. And just to say, in my opinion, I think that a lot of people in today's world do take them too far. And then they kind of get lost in the sauce, if you will. So just proceed with caution. And obviously, I'm not saying Layne was saying this or anything like that, obviously. I'm not saying that any of our guests are on that tip. But I just wanted to kind of throw that out there to just bring a little bit of balance to the table.
Yeah, and I agree with you. And I think that all of these things can be taken too far. And I think one of the follies of it is that it really brings you off balance. It really tends to put you into this place where you start following all these things and you're actually not really paying attention to what your decisions are bringing forth. You're just so focused on finding the next synchronicity that you're actually losing focus and you're losing yourself a little bit in it. And it can become like a really slippery slope, as you're basically saying.
I'll just throw out one example here. I had a student that I was seeing for a long time, and there was a very synchronistic, dreamlike event that happened in their life. And we decoded it over several sessions. And so they wanted to know what I thought it represented, what it meant symbolically. And over time, through these sessions, we kind of came to the conclusion, and once again, I have to give credit to Renee Ganon, who really emphasizes people getting lost in the psychic space, especially modern people. And I brought up the fact that, perhaps we're emphasizing this experience too much. Perhaps it's time to move on. Perhaps you're basically putting this experience in a place of a higher order where it doesn't deserve to be. And as soon as we came to that conclusion, it was almost like the spell was lifted. It was almost like now her sort of desire to know every single aspect of the situation, it just kind of dissipated. And so they were saying that this is exactly what they needed to hear, is not to fall deeper into it, but to actually let it go. And I think that that is sort of a little cautionary tale, for people, that it's not about falling into it and completely giving it your whole entire attention, but it's more so acknowledging it for what it is and then kind of moving on. And so I understand, though, because I've had dreams that were really, really impactful, but I could see if I had a different personality type, I maybe would have spent way more time trying to understand them, way more time emphasizing its value and whatnot.
Yes, that's a beautiful teaching to pass on. What this brings to mind in the moment is the fact that people are willing to put themselves in harm's way to seek the answers to things like this, or to continue to find the synchronicity, or to continue to understand what that thing was that happened. And they're forgetting that in the waking life, though, for you to find the answer to that actually might cause more strife because you're putting yourself in harm's way, or it's a dangerous situation that you're willing to go into just to find the answer to this thing that actually might not be worth your time realizing. Might be better off, as you're saying, just to let it go and allow yourself to continue on your journey.
In a way, it reminds me of what Mariana talked about earlier, of perhaps some of this information is best left in that domain,
right,
in that space, and not bringing it to the daylight and overanalyzing it.
Hi, Mario and Michelle. The symbolism of dreams. I love this topic, guys. For an avid dreamer like myself, who's been lucid dreaming since a child, this topic is close to my heart. You see, I see dreaming as a training ground, a place one can go to simulate practice and visualization, which can be used for self-mastery. As a child, I didn't know I was lucid dreaming. I only discovered what it was when I was late in adulthood. But basically, lucid dreaming is when you're deep in the dream state, but you're aware that you are in a dream and can control the dream narration to a certain degree. Sounds a bit like that Christopher Nolan movie, Inception. But as a child, I used it as a tool when I had nightmares. As the nightmare climaxed, I would mentally disagree with it and force a different resolution. And I did that by creating a totem animal to rescue me from the nightmare. Usually it was a white horse, but if I was in trouble, like in water, I would call upon a dolphin. Sleeping, and by extension dreaming, is often compared to death, and across cultures we find this association with dreaming and death or the afterlife. It makes me think of the shamanic soul flight, which is a belief that is perhaps based on the idea that when we sleep, our soul rises or hovers just above our body and travels. This may explain, the geomancy practice and feng shui to not keep mirrors facing your bed, as they believed or they thought the mirrors would disturb the soul's flight. And perhaps in many ways, dreams lie beyond the realm of time, as you can just as easily slip into the past as you can into the future, and sometimes even receive prophetic messages. Personally, I consider dreams the language of the unsaid, the language of the soul. If you pay attention to your dreams, it sharpens your intuition in the waking world. You see, we actually have more than 24 senses that are constantly picking up information, often subtle information from the world around us. It's mostly an unconscious act. Our body is the instrument, the receptor for this incoming data. But interpreting that data, well, that is up to us, as it is based on how well we know ourselves. I'll give you just a quick explanation of how this works. Let's say today you met up with a friend, bumped into them at the shops. The friend was super friendly and really nice to your face. But that night you went to sleep, you had a strange dream about that friend in a scenario that suggested that they were actually quite annoyed and jealous of you, dwelling on a dispute you had years ago. You see, your dreams sometimes project to you what your 20 plus senses read, the underlying currents between you and that friend. Your dreams can sometimes act out what your body and soul sensed was unsaid. And that, folks, is why I keep a dream journal. It is very useful in decoding one's inner self, the inner and outer worlds. I'm going to end it there, but thanks, guys, again for letting me share a few of my thoughts on dreaming. And if anyone's interested, you can find me on the Venus Diaries on Substack. Thanks, guys.
All right, Katriena, thank you so much for that voicemail submission. Very cool. I'm not surprised you have an active dream life, by the way. That makes a ton of sense. And I like what you said regarding the language of the unsaid. Very, very interesting. You brought up the fact that we have a lot of senses and not everything necessarily is picked up consciously, if you will, but that your body's picking it up, your mind is picking it up, your emotions or what have you. And these other senses are picking it up. And that this is what's coming through in the dream world, that it's sort of interpreting this data and it's giving it to you in a symbolic form. Very, very interesting. I've never been much of a lucid dreamer personally. There's been a few times, of course, where it's happened. But the fact that you can change the trajectory of a dream, the fact that you even had animals to rescue you, a horse or a dolphin, to me, that is just so interesting and fascinating because my dreams don't necessarily work that way. I'm sure if I put the time in, though, I could probably do some of that stuff. The idea of the dream realm being a training ground of sorts, that's kind of a whole weave and rabbit hole because so many people who have gone through various projects, I'll just say MK Ultra type projects, have said very similar things. That in their dream world, this is when they were actually training to become a soldier. They were training to do these different operations and different tasks and whatnot. And then they wake up and they're back in their room and they have their normal life. But at night while they were dreaming, they were doing all sorts of fantastical things. So there's definitely something going on with that for sure. What is happening? I don't know. But I've talked to several people that claim very, very similar things. So the training ground idea, that seems true on like perhaps more than one level, actually. So I'll just leave it at that. But I know you have some things to say regarding lucid dreaming and some herbs that'll help you with that, right?
Yes, totally. Thank you, Katriena, as always. Was really looking forward to hearing what you had to say about dreams. And I, too, agree that there can be a psychic connection that's happening during dream time, helping us to balance out things that happened in the waking life, those senses that you talked about that we all do have that take some time for us to develop a way to connect to them. But dreams are a really great way to do that because you are going to be able to get some of those undercurrents that you maybe weren't able to pick up on in your waking life. Couldn't have a dream episode without talking about mugwort, right? I know I bring it up a lot, but it is one of those plants that has so many connections to the dream realm. And what's interesting about mugwort and the way I look at it is that it's typically traditionally looked at as a lunar plant for many good reasons, but it's also connected to Venus. And the whole connection to dreams with mugwort, particularly lucid dreaming, I think really has a lot to do with the scent of mugwort. And there is some sort of mysterious intrigue that is happening with mugwort and the way it smells. Mugwort has been used for a long time as a plant to be put next to the bed and or underneath one's pillow to bring on these prophetic lucid dreams. And I think that it's the scent of mugwort that actually kind of keeps us in that liminal space or in that REM state because it's such a pungent scent. That's just my own interpretation. I think taking it internally or smoking it in an herbal cigarette is another way that you can consume the mugwort to get to these places. And when you look at mugwort and its constituents, it's the thujone that is present in the plant that is slightly psychoactive. And I think that that's where we get the connection to the dream realm with the plant. Also, it is related to wormwood, which is the main herbal ingredient in absinthe, which is even stronger than mugwort.
Right. Very interesting.
And so there is like a level of toxicity that comes along with thujon or thujon, however you'd like to pronounce it.
And what is that? Because I'm not going to be the only one who doesn't know what that is.
It's basically one of the essential oils that are in the plant. It's one of the constituents that can bring on like a psychoactive element when you're taking it internally. And that's one of the reasons why it is connected to these sort of psychic, dreamy, astral, liminal spaces, because it puts you in that kind of almost like a waking dream feeling.
Well, that's exactly what absinthe does for you.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah, that's perfect.
And I wanted you to talk a little bit about this, but the whole element of absinthe, or perhaps it is the thujon in the plant that actually can help bring on visions. And you had an experience with absinthe that actually increased your vision or amplified your vision that you noticed.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It was really interesting. So for people who don't know, I do have minor vision impairment, especially at night. My night vision isn't so great. I don't need glasses or anything like that, but it is noticeable these days. So if I'm driving at night, I'm just extra cautious, of course. But when I was on absinthe one time, I was blown away at how much I can see everything. And so literally my pupils were dilated, and it was almost like I had night vision or something like that. So it was just one of these experiences where I kept on looking around because it was at night. I kept on looking around. I'm like, damn, I can see that. I can see that too. Holy shit, I can see that too. And it was familiar stuff. So I know what I generally can see in that space. And with the absinthe, it really just like completely like opened things up and allowed in more light. And everything to me felt much closer as well.
Now, that's such a beautiful experience. And now flip that onto bringing vision into your inner world, your inner eye, so to say. There's a lot of connections with mugwort and the third eye, and it opening up that kind of internal sacred vision that we all have, or that sacred ability we all have to kind of like see past some of the physical things. And I think that that's just a really great way to look at it in that way, of how it can like open up your spectrum of vision, allow you to see things that you didn't see before, or that you're not seeing in your waking life, but in the dream realm, you're actually going to be able to see it. And the mugwort can help bring you there.
Well, you know, that's interesting that you even brought up the third eye as it relates to dreams, because it hasn't come up yet. But when I think of the third eye, a lot of times I do think of this inner sight. Sometimes you can refer to it, I think, as second sight. And I feel like there's a couple of different interpretations with what second sight means. But this internal vision, seeing within, essentially, not external, not peering out into the physical world, but sort of looking within your own inner landscape. I mean, dreams relate to that very strongly, right?
Oh, big time. And Robin Rose Bennett, who is an herbalist that I really enjoy, and the way she talks about dreams and mugwort is that mugwort not only allows you to have a deeper relationship with your dreams, but it's the dreams that reside within your heart. It's the dreams that you have to create something great, or the very deep yearning you have to accomplish something that you really feel passionate about. And I think that that's a really beautiful way of looking at it too, and going back to that internal thing that I think really what dreams are trying to do for us is to allow us to see those very deep, passionate dreams that we hold within.
Right, definitely. And of course, I want you to get back to herbal symbolism here with everything. But I just have to say, just like with the traditional medicine perspective and what we were talking about with Layne's voicemail, your perspective on the situation really dictates a lot. So two people can go through the same traumatic event. One person is relatively unscathed. The other person is devastated. And so, as an example with the Ray Charles thing, there's other people who've had very similar situations, but they didn't go blind.
Right.
So your own individual perspective on things dictates quite a bit, I would say. So that is to say, what your inner landscape looks like is really going to influence your perception of everything. So as an example, the situation that Layne highlighted with the skunk, for someone else, they maybe wouldn't think that that situation stinks as much as that one person did. Mm-hmm. And so it's your filter, it's where you're at, not necessarily the external circumstances that's going to dictate a lot of things. So this just reiterates the whole idea of your internal dialogue, your internal landscape, and things like that. So if someone, I'm just curious, I have no idea if there's any information about this or not, someone who is internally at peace versus someone who's always internally conflicted, do they have different types of dreams?
That's a great question.
And what are those dreams saying? Mm-hmm. What are the symbols that come through? I would imagine someone who's perpetually agitated and is always going through the ringer and feels as though the world is against them, they're going to have very different dreams than the person who is basically in a harmonious place in their life, right?
Yeah, I would agree.
So just something to think about.
I believe an even superior herb for dreams is poppy. And I'm talking about the opium poppy. And there is so much stuff related to dreams and the dreamlike state that opium can put someone into. And now this plant has obviously been utilized to make harder drugs that are more damaging, and also pharmaceuticals that can be really detrimental to a person's health and to their own state. But all that aside, the poppy itself is such a source of valuable medicine that has been demonized and made kind of inaccessible because of the fear that's around it. Because at one point, poppy and opium was in people's apothecaries at home for common ailments such as headaches and colds and flus and bumps and bruises and things like this. But beyond all of that, the ability it has to bring someone into a relaxed state far enough to take them out of pain they're feeling so that they can get the rest that they need in order to heal from whatever's ailing them. As I was preparing for the episode, I was reminded that we have a card that is like just an illustration of a poppy plant. Mm-hmm. And on the card, it says consolation of sleep. And the quote that's also on that card is sleep that knits up the raveled sleeve of care. Mm-hmm. And now I've always wondered what that means. And we looked it up before the show, and it's actually a quote from the Shakespearean play Macbeth. And to translate that, what it basically is trying to say is that sleep repairs what the worries and activities of waking life have unraveled. Mm-hmm. And so that is, I think, what our dreams, but also our dreamless sleep is trying to do for us, is trying to bind us back together. And I think a plant like poppy is doing that in many ways. And it's also known that poppy puts you into like a dreamlike state while you're awake. And sometimes these states would be known as an opium dream. So it was sometimes hard to differentiate whether or not the person was actually dreaming or if they were hallucinating what they were seeing. And there's also been things about opium that talk about how it's bringing about prophetic dreams and profound dreams of astonishing clarity. And there's all these artists and poets that were steeped in the tradition of opium smoking and being in opium dens. Whether or not they took it too far, that's another thing. I'm not quite sure, but it was an individual sort of experience, I'll definitely say. And from the book Opium for the Masses, which I've also talked about on the Pisces episode that we put out, he talks about the Greek gods and goddesses that are actually associated with poppy. And so we have Nyx, who is the goddess of night, Hypnos, god of sleep, Morpheus, god of dreams, and Thanos, the god of death. So all of these gods and goddesses who are associated with this plant all fall within the range of the things we're talking about right now.
100%. And actually, I believe we get morphine from Morpheus.
Yes.
Yeah. So this whole weave, we could do an episode literally on the symbolism of just sleep, right? And so I love that quote, the Shakespearean quote. When we sleep, that's when our body repairs.
Yes.
And obviously think about how relaxing sleep is and how that's almost sometimes our only sort of like escape is to go to bed.
Yeah.
When you are really stressed out, going to sleep is amazing. And as soon as you wake up, you're like, I still have to deal with the problems I was dealing with yesterday. But it was nice to be able to have some rest, and not necessarily think about this for, a handful of hours. So yeah, no, sleep is so important. It's so crucial. A lot of people don't get a good night's rest, but all of these things are really well taken.
And isn't it interesting, too, that unfortunately, sometimes things like opium or the things that are derived from it are used to escape. So as you're talking about sleep being a reprieve, it's like a place where we can get the relief. Unfortunately, some people will lean on drugs and alcohol and other things as crutches so that they can try and escape the reality that they're in. Meanwhile, it's like you could naturally do that just by taking a rest.
Yeah. I mean, nowadays we have these street drugs that are so strong and you don't need that much. And it basically just knocks you out.
Exactly. And one of the final things I wanted to touch upon with poppy, opium stimulates the higher brain functions of the cerebral cortex, even as it depresses the central nervous system. Now, to me, this does validate what you were saying about this, that our dreams and all of these things that we're talking about are actually coming from a higher realm. They're coming from a higher place. And this quote illustrates that actually that's what opium is stimulating, but you also don't need opium in order to stimulate those higher places of our brain, obviously. But it just kind of like further illustrates this, that we are going to a higher place when we're in these realms, when we are dreaming, when we're kind of trying to decipher all these things. It's coming from a higher place within.
Right. Well, you know what this kind of reminds me of is The Wizard of Oz. So the four main characters are about to reach Emerald City, and Emerald City to me is like the sacred center of Oz. Even in the books, they describe that Emerald City is at the center of Oz. So that's a huge clue as to what it really represents. And so this is almost like reaching the peak of the mountain, symbolically, going to Emerald City. Right before they're about to reach it, because they see it in the distance, they know that they're close, they run through a field of poppies. And then two of them fall asleep, and the other two, Scarecrow and the Tin Man, they're not made of flesh, so they don't fall asleep. But Glinda, the Good Witch, she comes in to save the day. So you have this higher power, coming in to basically send them on their way, get them over this final hurdle, this last trial before they reach Emerald City, and then they reach Emerald City. So it's just kind of interesting that there's this poppy dream sequence before they reach this sort of final destination. It's almost like this last thing before they reach the apex of the mountain or what have you, before they perceive their problems to be finally solved and resolved, right? And so it's just kind of intriguing that it almost feels like the last rung on a ladder or something like that they had to cross through, or some sort of threshold or whatnot. And so I don't feel like I want to completely unpack that, but where this poppy sequence happens is kind of a pivotal point in the story. And actually, that's the artwork that they use for Opium for the Masses, the book you're talking about.
Yeah, it's a depiction of Dorothy in a field of poppies.
Right?
Yeah,
exactly.
Hi, Jeff here. Just wanted to give a few pieces of advice for dreams. First of all, what is your earliest dream? Maybe you should think about it, because it could be like an archetype for your whole life. My earliest dream was stepping out of the back of my mom's minivan as a young child, because this was when I was like 2 years old. And then as I stood up, I grew into a full man, and like Mario, almost like growing up, like eating a mushroom. And then in the background, fireworks went off. And I didn't know what that meant until I became an adult. And it was like, really, the world went from black and white to color one day when I found my true love. So that's a pretty cool tip. Also, reoccurring dreams seem to have a prophetic nature, something to look out for. Symbols that people should know of in dreams. The house represents the self, said Jung. So if you ever have house dreams, something to explore is what it means for the self. I think the most important principle for dreams is that of compensation, which Jung talked about, where he said that someone who lives a boring life might have very fantastic dreams. So when I was younger, I used to have some very vivid dreams, like fantastic. I'll share one later. But then when I got my own house, I moved onto my own land and started building a food forest. I suddenly had like a major drop off of dreams. Why? I think it's because I'm literally living the dream right now, and therefore I didn't have as much needing to be compensated for. Now, I did say I had some really cool dreams, so I want to share this one for everybody. I was in a community center, and I looked down, and there was like the pool that was there was like glowing blue, and inside of it I saw two fish doing yin-yang moves, like the fish in Avatar, where they're like swimming around each other, so really like Pisces. And then suddenly a giant ball of fire went past me, and then I looked at what it was a phoenix, and I saw where it went into a portal. And when I looked into that portal, I could see that there was another portal, and then another portal, and it was going through an infinite series of portals. And if you had no fear, you could see down the entirety of them. It was just one endless, like if you lined up two mirrors together. But as soon as you had a little bit of fear, they got offset, and then you wouldn't see the next portal. So that's really a deep dream. I think there's a lot of value in that, just imagining what it's like to be fearless and then having the infinite line up for you. So anyways, cheers everybody, and thanks for letting me share. Love symbolic studies.
All right, Jeff, thanks for that short submission there. Interesting stuff. There's a few things I definitely want to talk about. This idea of trying to find out your earliest dreams and how telling they are with where your life led you, I think is very intriguing. There's a few dreams that I had when I was younger that I can't believe I still remember. And now all of these years later, I'm like, that makes a lot of sense. Also, you mentioned reoccurring dreams. This reminded me of the fact that Michelle and I, maybe like 3 or 4 years ago, we went down this little rabbit hole with our parents, asking them what their reoccurring dreams were. And I'll say they were very, very enlightening. Mm-hmm. When I asked my dad his reoccurring dreams, I was like, oh my goodness, this makes so much sense with your psychology and everything you've gone through, that this is what you would be dreaming. And then when I asked my mom, same sort of thing. And I know you asked your parents as well. And it was very revealing, right?
It was very revealing. And I went as far as to asking my grandmother as well. And it was actually through my grandmother who I found the most insight, and not only about her life, but then about myself.
That's right. Yeah.
And there was a lot of crossover, and there was a lot of things that I was able to glean from her experiences in her dream time that actually helped me to get over a few things that I have reoccurring in my actual waking life that I was always trying to, remedy or trying to make better. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, definitely. I remember now specifically what your grandmother's reoccurring dreams were, and it was very insightful.
Yeah, very insightful. It helped make so much more sense of her and her life. It helped me to understand her better.
So I'll just say, if you're with somebody, ask your partner, ask your spouse, your boyfriend or girlfriend what their reoccurring dreams are. You're definitely going to learn something. You'll probably have a productive conversation. If your parents are still around, ask them. And of course, if your grandparents are still around, ask them. There's no way you're not going to learn something here. Also, this idea of compensation that Jeff mentioned, if you have a boring life, you may have a fantastical dream world. It made me think of compensation on a different level. And it made me think of cannabis. And if I'm smoking cannabis, I do not dream. And this is a really common thing with people who smoke, that they cease to dream. And to me, it's because cannabis, in so many ways, it opens you up and you start seeing sort of the symbolic value or the sacredness of things in your waking life. That's partly what it does. It's almost like an aperture opening up, allowing in more light. And so to me, if you're experiencing that, I can kind of see why you wouldn't dream. And then as soon as you stop, at least for me, my dreams come back online and they're very, very vivid. And this is always something that's pretty reliable for me, actually. And so to me, there is some sort of compensation dynamic with that. And I could see that with people's lives too. I can totally see that being the case. And so just on multiple levels, I can see this sort of overall kind of balancing of scales being true.
Yeah, I know that that's been a thing for you for a long time. And I know some other people that have that same experience. And actually, one person in particular I remember who had never tried mugwort and always claimed to not remember their dreams or that they don't dream, and they are heavy cannabis users. They took some of my mugwort tincture and they dreamed that first night. And it was the first dream they had had in a long time, because they typically don't. So again, going back to that whole thing of mugwort or whatever it might be, helping to stimulate this inner sight that we all have, that maybe the mugwort was like the vehicle for that person to be able to dream once again, or at least just to remember the dreams. Because I've also heard people say it's not that you don't dream, it's just that you don't remember them, that you do have dreams, but your mind perhaps isn't remembering them.
Right. And I'll just say that multiple people have taken your mugwort tincture and have said the exact same thing, that the first night they took it, they had very vivid, profound, extremely deep, detailed dreams.
Yeah, totally. I was intrigued by what Jeff said with the fact that he felt as though he didn't have dreams when he moved on to his own land and began to cultivate plants and things like that. And he attributed this to the fact that he was, quote, living the dream, so that he felt as though he maybe didn't need to be dreaming while he was sleeping. And what it makes me think of is what we talked about earlier on in the episode, is that perhaps somebody who's more at peace isn't having as many dreams, or they're maybe not having disturbing dreams or what have you, because they're finally at peace with something, and we all go through times in our life where we do finally feel peace, or we have a sense of peace after a time of not having a sense of peace. And there is a massive amount of relief that can come from that. And I feel like our whole being is going to illustrate that. So it would make sense that the result of feeling that peace might be that while you're sleeping, you're not feeling like you're having to search for an answer for something because you found it in your waking life.
Well, this reminds me of something we just heard, and it was with a person who's an American going overseas to Japan specifically, and they got arrested. And they were the only English-speaking person in the whole entire prison system. And they were there for about a month. And they were talking about how basically they started dreaming, and they would have conversations in their dream world because they weren't able to do that in their waking life. And so I thought that was a really, really interesting sort of detail there. Kind of to your point. So you're in a stressful situation. You obviously wish you can escape. And so your dreams are giving you an avenue,
right?
Kind of this release valve almost in a way, to where you can actually at least have a conversation with somebody. And then he would wake up and then realize that he obviously wasn't talking to anybody, but it at least was sort of an outlet for him to be able to communicate what was on his mind. And he was saying that he was even talking about what it was like to be there and everything else. I'll say personally, and I've expressed this to other people, and they basically don't have the same opinion or perspective, but if I'm ever going through it and there's a stressful situation in my life, my dreams always basically give me some sort of outlet to feel less stressed, to feel like things are resolving, to feel like maybe things aren't as dire as I think they are in my waking life. Almost reliably, this is sort of the case. So I almost feel like it gives me some sort of solution, or it gives me some sort of perceived balance that I'm not feeling in my waking life. So maybe the last thing I'm going to say here regarding dreams and dream symbolism is this idea that if we are communicating with a higher sort of order, if we're communicating with source or something along these lines, you only get to this place through this step-by-step sort of dynamic. It's sort of this gradation. And so you don't go from being awake to dreaming. You're going to be awake, and then you're going to start falling asleep. And then it's sort of this step-by-step thing. And there's, of course, been a million studies and a million sort of things with this about how much time it takes for you to get to that point where you are dreaming. And then, of course, there's deep sleep that's even beyond dreaming and everything else. But all of this is sort of this slow step-by-step sort of process. And everything really in life works this way, that you're not going to go from point A to point Z and skip everything in between. Dreaming is very, very much like this. I think it's really interesting that I think this is lore or that this is sort of a repeated fact that maybe isn't necessarily true, but I've come across it multiple times, that it takes humans 7 minutes to fall asleep. And so the number 7 is endlessly fascinating to me. And so 7 really has this cyclical sort of dynamic. This is why it relates to the Chariot card in the tarot. It's basically said that we create sort of all new cells in our body every 7 years. And so the number 7, right? 7 chakras, 7 days of the week. I've gone on and on and on about the number 7 and how significant it is. But it's the perfect alchemical number. And so 7 steps, 7 tiers, 7 thresholds, to turn, quote, lead into gold, right? And so it just reminds me that the number 7, if that is the average time it takes for someone to fall asleep, it takes me longer personally. But this idea that the number 7 is sort of associated with this kind of reminds me of almost the alchemical process of 7 different steps to get to this rest, to get to falling asleep or what have you. So I just wanted to sort of mention that, because when we're dealing with dreams, it's this very liminal sort of dynamic that we're talking about here. It's very etheric. It's not tangible, in the way that a lot of other things are. And so in order to get from your waking life, that's very physical, material based, for many people, mundane, to get from everyday life, if you will, to this mystical sort of thing with your dreams, that it is this sort of slow kind of process that you don't just get there once your head hits the pillow. In a way, it's its own little journey, if you will. And it's almost kind of alchemical in many ways, because to get to the sacred center of a thing, it's also the exact same thing. So the Holy of Holies in a temple, there's 6 or 7 thresholds that you have to cross. There's the outer courtyard, and then there's the temple walls, and then there's an inner space, and then an inner space, and then a space within that. So you can't access the sacred center or Holy of Holies immediately, the same way sort of any sacred center usually is protected, in some way, shape, or form. There's usually boundaries that have to be crossed. And so I think it's very much the same way with our dream realm, where there has to be thresholds and boundaries that have to be crossed before you finally get to this place, not unlike reaching Emerald City. All the things that all the characters had to get through in order to reach Emerald City. Most symbolism, when you're talking about sort of this thing that connects heaven and earth, I would say that dreams symbolically kind of operate in very much a similar sort of fashion, that it's almost a bridge between above and below, if you will. In order to get to that place, it takes steps, that you have to go through the necessary steps in order to get there. And most myths and storylines that kind of basically symbolically represent the same thing, it's always the case. For the character to transmute and change and evolve, it takes a series of steps. It doesn't just happen immediately. So just wanted to throw that out there for what it's worth. All right, guys, that's going to do it. We'll see you soon for an episode on the symbolism of Leo.
Thanks, everyone.
And this wraps up Symbolic Studies episode 20, which we recorded on July 20th. Thanks to everyone who contributed to this one, especially our special guests. Mariana Louis can be found at PersephoneSister.com, and be sure and check out her book, Tarot and the Psychology of the Soul. J.M. DeBord can be found at jmdebord.com, and be sure and check out his book, Dreams 1, 2, 3. Layne Dalfen can be found at thedreamanalyst.com. You can also find her on Instagram, Layne_thedreamanalyst. Katriena can be found at the Venus Diaries on Substack, or at KatrienaEmmanuel.com. As always, you can explore the Symbolic Studies archive for early podcast access, exclusive lectures, symbolic research, and more. Visit symbolicstudies.com to sign up. Once again, in case you weren't aware, I am available for tarot readings and private lessons. You can schedule a session on the website if you would like to have a private one-on-one session with yours truly. Also, I've been a designer for well over half my life. If you're in need of creative assistance with your project, check out my portfolio and get in touch. Links to all my accounts can be found at symbolicstudies.com. And once again, if you finished this episode and want even more insights, we'll be releasing a companion episode where Michelle and I continue the conversation in after hours. And that'll do it for this episode. We'll see you soon with a show on the symbolism of Leo.